Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a very special Grand Rounds today. I'm Dr. Matt Winnie. I direct the Center for Bioethics and Humanities for the University of Colorado, and I am honored to introduce our speaker today. As background, in 1979, the US Congress designated a week each spring to be the Days of Remembrance of Victims of the Holocaust. And during this week, institutions around the country are encouraged to hold commemorative and learning events about this history. Thanks to an initial gift 10 years ago now from Dr. Bill Silvers and many, many additional contributions since then by many people in this room and online today. On our campus, we have focused these annual lectures on learning about the key roles that medical professionals played during the Nazi era and how this history has helped to create modern medical ethics and what we must learn from this history to address events of today and to create a better tomorrow. As you will hear from our speaker today, this history is both more complex and, if anything, more disturbing than you might think it is. It is convenient to oversimplify this history, even to misrepresent it to suit various ends. And it is surprisingly difficult to learn from this history. Why is it that we say never again, but then doctors are involved in atrocities again and again and again? Our speaker today brings exceptional knowledge and wisdom to answering this challenging question. Dr. Volker Roelcke is chair of the Institute of the History, Theory, and Ethics of Medicine at Gießen University in Germany. He did his medical training in psychiatry and neurology at Heidelberg University, studied philosophy at Cambridge, and the history of medicine at Bonn University. Dr. Roelcke served as chair of the Commission of the German Association of Psychiatry, researching its history during the Nazi period, leading eventually to its public apology. He was a founding co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust, and he's been instrumental in pressing German medical groups and the World Medical Association to confront how they have grappled with or often failed to grapple with their roles in the aftermath of the Nazi era. If there are those of you who would like to continue the conversation with Dr. Roelcke after Grand Rounds today, he will be available to chat from 1:30 to 2:30 this afternoon on the second floor of the Fulginity Pavilion. It's a beautiful walk across campus in our Center for Bioethics and Humanities. For now, though, I'd like to ask you to welcome me in join me in welcoming Dr. Volker Roelcke to the University of Colorado's Medical Grand Rounds.
Thank you very much, Matt, for this introduction. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. It's a topic which is of very great importance for me personally, but I think it is also of enormous importance for the medical community in general. Well, what do we know about Nazi medical crimes today? What is the available historical evidence? And what are the implications of this history for today? These are the two guiding questions for my presentation. To answer these questions, I shall start by presenting a very short interpretation of what happened on the basis of the available historical evidence, evidence-based history, if you want. And I want just to guide you with this short interpretation through the whole presentation, like a red thread. Then in the second part, which might be the largest, most extended part, I will present a short summary of the available historical evidence. The next part, I shall describe three types of behavior patterns by individual physicians and also by professional medical bodies in the post-World War II period in response to the medical atrocities during the Nazi period. And finally, I shall describe 3 basic ethical codes or declarations formulated in response to these medical atrocities. Well, the tentative interpretation on the basis of the available evidence would be what happened in medicine during the Nazi period was not specific for this period, and this might surprise some of you. But I would argue that it was rather a particularly extreme manifestation of problematic potentials inherent in modern medicine in general. And I realize, and I know from experience, formulating this kind of interpretation, that there might be some kind of surprise or irritation. And I hope that we'll have a chance to discuss that at the end or after the presentation. I shall try to present you the main evidence for this claim in the following minutes. Well, if this claim, if this interpretation is appropriate, then you might use the evidence, the historical evidence of the historical case to study problematic potentials of modern medicine, which are ubiquitous, but you can see them in a particularly prominent way in the Nazi period. Problematic potentials such as the mechanisms and dynamics of opportunism and the abuse of power, which are not specific for the Nazi period. The rise, dynamics, and intrinsic pitfalls of problematic value hierarchies. For example, the priority of the collective good compared to the individual good, or the priority of producing new knowledge in medical research over the well-being of the research subject. Another aspect would be the rise and intrinsic dangers of medical or biological interpretations of social phenomena and social groups, what I want to call the biologization of social facts. And we find this all over the place, if you want, continuously in public debates, like the biologization of fertility rates of populations or epidemiological data, or of social groups or populations. And here you know the most radical form of this kind of biologization would be the concept of race. But there are other concepts as well, like the biogeographical ancestry, a concept which is used today based on data from population genetics and used in forensic medicine, for instance. Okay, we can discuss all these points at a later stage, because I want to, first of all, to introduce you to the available historical evidence. And I shall present this in chronological order in a few subtopics to the general topic, medicine during the Nazi period. Chronological order, starting in 1933, the year the Nazis came to power. And it's important for me to stress also in this present-day historical situation that the Nazis came to power after an election and within sort of existing democratic formal regulations, by building a coalition with other very conservative parties. So there was no military coup or anything else. It was a sort of legal kind of procedure on the basis of existing democratic rules, which brought this kind of government into power. And I think this is something which should be said and should give us some cause for thought. Well, one of the first things the new government did was the so-called Gleichschaltung in German, or systematic coordination of all public institutions and instances, but also of medical institutions and associations, according to what they called the Führerprinzip. You know, the term Führer for Hitler, and the Führer would appoint Führer on a level below him, and these Führers would appoint further Führers below. So every organization was organized from top down by this Führer principle. in contrast to the system which existed prior to that in the preceding Weimar Republic, which was a democratic situation. And there was a bottom-up organization of organizations, including, for instance, medical schools, universities, or medical associations. Well, this started, it's a process which went on for some years. It didn't happen in 1 second or in 1 day or a few weeks, but it took years to put that into the envisaged practice. But it started immediately after the takeover. Another process which started immediately and actually started already in a way before, but was the stigmatization, dismissal from public offices, forced migration, and finally also the systematic extermination of physicians defined as Jewish or defined as politically unreliable, which referred, for instance, to socialists. I use this formulation of defined as Jewish, not persecution of Jews, because the number of Jews, or the group of the Jews, of those called Jews, termed Jews, categorized as Jews, increased suddenly after the Nazi takeover, because they introduced a new definition of who was a Jew. That was anybody who had Jewish parents, grandparents, and so on and so on. So it was, in a way, an implicit genetic biological definition that implied that even people who were at the time, in 1933, Protestants or Catholics or disinterested in religion, but who had perhaps Jewish ancestors, they were suddenly labeled as Jews. Also, they had no Jewish identity. They were some of them were really surprised. There are interesting testimonies, even of philosophers and literary authors, and so they were, you know, highly irritated that they should be Jews. Anyway, so the number of Jews increased suddenly, considerably, and they were all persecuted in this way. They were kicked out of their offices in public institutions like university, medical schools, or municipal hospitals, and so on. Yeah, and this was just the beginning of an escalating process of stigmatization, and which led to the forced migration of quite a number of them, but not all of them were able to decide to leave the country for various reasons. And even those who migrated, for instance, to the United States, they were not all of them were successful. We know some of the success stories of those emigres, but quite a high number of people committed suicide, actually, because they didn't manage to establish themselves as physicians in the countries where they went to, like the United States. Anyway, another dimension, another aspect of what happened was the public rhetoric of strengthening the folk body in terms of biology. I mean, already talking about the folk body is sort of a framing in terms of biology, yeah? The population is seen as one organism, the folk or the folk body, which has to be manipulated in a positive way, as they thought it, to strengthen it, empower it, make it fit for, you know, the competition with other races, other folk bodies, and finally also for the envisaged war. Another method or means which was sort of talked about, that hygiene, there was a strong movement of social hygiene in the Weimar Republic, the period preceding the Nazi period, that hygiene should be extended to the race, to the folk body, and therefore it should be rather called, instead of social hygiene, it should be called racial hygiene. Another example of biologizing social phenomena. Okay. And interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly for some of you, for most of you, I would assume, is that the Nazi government introduced medical ethics, or frequently called at that time medical deontology, in the medical curriculum all over the Reich, all over Germany. So every medical student was sort of had to be educated in medical ethics. So we usually think that medical ethics is helpful to create an ethical behavior of physicians, what we think is an ethical behavior, but there are different kinds of ethical behavior and different kinds of ethics, if you want. And this was a kind of ethics which was taught at medical schools from that period onwards, which had worked with very specific value hierarchies. And this is perhaps the most specific one, or the most prominent one. I shouldn't say specific, because you will find it in other situations of medicine as well. But this is a value hierarchy that the collective good is prioritized over the individual good. We know that very well. I mean, for instance, a few years ago in the pandemic, we saw that the protection of the population justifies some kinds of restrictions to the individual rights. And there are good reasons for that. If this is for a limited period and for specific kinds of activity, contexts, and so on and so on. But in this Nazi context, it was more radical, and it was a permanent situation. Always should the collective good be prioritized over the individual good. It was not limited in time and space and contexts. Okay, so this was what happened immediately, or processes which started immediately after the Nazi takeover in early 1933. But there was not only a talk about the hygiene of the race, or racial hygiene, or strengthening the folk body, but there were policies and practices following from that. And there were two very big programs which tried to implement these kind of talk and ideas, which existed actually long before 1933, but which were taken up from medical debates by the Nazi government in collusion with the medical community. And they put into a very extreme or radical or consequent, you might say in a more positive formulation, they put that into a practice, the biological cleaning and strengthening of the folk body in this program of forced sterilization to get rid of all individuals with bad genes, to improve the gene pool, if you want, in a rather more modern language. There was a law introduced very quickly after the takeover, a law which had been initiated actually by physicians and medical organizations. They already had tried to get such a law in the preceding Weimar Republic, but they were not successful, the medical organizations. But this law was taken out of the drawer, in a way, and modified a little bit, and it was passed in July 1933 as so-called Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Ill Offspring. A law, again, as I said, initiated by physicians. And interestingly, many of you might know this, this German, Nazi German law, if you want, was modeled on already existing laws in various US American states. Also, there exists such a law in Denmark before the Nazi takeover. So it was a law which led to the sterilization of 350,000 to 400,000 individuals. The definite numbers are not yet clarified. It's difficult to clarify them, actually. And these physicians, the physicians made the indication for the sterilization because they, after a process of evaluation by hereditary health courts, which were dominated by physicians, there was one lawyer on these courts, but the rest of the members of these courts were physicians, and they decided, they took the family history and so on, the genealogy of the patient, and they came to a diagnosis if it is a condition caused by heredity, and then the patient was asked if he agreed to be sterilized. if you agreed, it was okay, and a small number of those concerned agreed, but the vast majority didn't agree, and they could be sterilized, and they were sterilized against their will. Okay, so this was the first program to strengthen the folk body, and it was put into practice in the 1st of January 1934, very officially with much propaganda associated, and it ended only with the end of the regime and the end of the Second World War in 1945. The second, even more radical and destructive program was the program which is sometimes called euthanasia program, because that's the term used by the historical actors. It was a systematic killing of almost 300,000 patients. Again, we don't know the exact numbers yet because of problems with the sources, with the historical sources, but it's at least 250,000, probably more, like 300,000 psychiatric patients and mentally handicapped individuals in the period during the war. That means between 1939 and 45. These were people, the target population, if you want, of this measure, or measures in the plural, were populations in institutions like mental asylums or old age homes. And the part in these institutions which was defined as life unworthy of living, this was the official phrasing, this part should be exterminated, excluded, to get rid of this ballast and the associated financial costs, expenses. The diagnosis about life unworthy of living, again, was made by physicians, so it was not done by any politicians, but all the population of these institutions, they were looked at. There was an expert group of roughly 40 expert evaluators for this program, and they decided about life and death of patients or inmates of these institutions. There were 3 programs, actually separate organizational programs, but they were interlinked to each other. A program of child euthanasia, which lasted from 1939 to 45, which was related to quite an elaborate process of evaluation of the mentally retarded children mainly, because children were seen as a very valuable asset of the state. One needed children, one should have many children, and so on. So they were a little bit more careful and to kill them. And therefore, this process was a little bit more extended to evaluate and decide about their death. But about roughly 10,000 children, mainly mentally handicapped children, were killed in this process. And there was the process of adult euthanasia, the so-called Aktion T4 program, which was really horrific, also in the sense how it was done in practice, in a very systematic kind of industrialized way, killing patients in gas chambers. There were 6 institutions, formerly psychiatric institutions, converted, 6 institutions in the German Reich, distributed in the northwest, in the northeast, and southeast, and so on. They were converted in killing centers, which meant that there was a gas chamber built in the cellar, established in the cellar of these institutions, and also a crematorium to burn the bodies after the killings. And patients from all institutions, more than 120 institutions all over the German Reich, they were evaluated, and those who were diagnosed as being unworthy of living, they were deported to these killing centers and put into the gas chamber. This program was actually stopped already in 1941 because of some kind of disquiet and unease in the population, which the government realized that it exists, and they were a bit worried because at the same time the war was going not as wished by the government in the East, in particular in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. So they thought we don't want to have the population sort of being uneasy with us, with the government, and criticizing the government. So they stopped it preliminarily. The government stopped this program, but only until the final victory was sort of had come, because afterwards it should be started again. And after this stop in 1941 of these centralized killings, again, as I said, carried through by doctors, the killings went on in a more decentralized and hidden fashion in all psychiatric asylums, more than 120, as I said, asylums in the German Reich. And the decisions were now taken locally, not in a central killing office. This was located in Berlin, in the Tiergartenstraße 4. That's the reason why this was called Aktion T4. But after 41, the killings went on in a more decentralized fashion with local decisions by physicians and also in part nurses in the individual institutions. Well, a third subtopic to the whole topic Nazi medicine or medicine during the Nazi period is the abuse of individuals for medical research and teaching. Forced medical research took place in what I want to call deregulated spaces. And I want to call them deregulated spaces for a certain reason, because I also want to make an allusion to sort of talk about deregulation as something very positive. But if you think it through, you will see that this is a problematic concept of deregulation. I'm talking about deregulation here, or deregulated spaces, because perhaps also counter to your intuition, or to what we assume, there existed rules and rules for the protection of research subjects in medical research. There existed quite protective rules, actually, and ethics for human subject research. So these brutal research, which you have heard of, like associated with the name of Mengele and many others, was not the result of a situation where there were no rules and there was no ethics of human subject research. On the contrary, these were the first international rules, as far as we know, to protect human subjects in medical research. They dated from the preceding Weimar Republic, but they were in existence through all the Nazi period until the early post-war period. And they were acknowledged even by medical functionaries of the regime itself, that they were important and they should be kept too. But at the same time, it was clear for all physicians interested in research that the state had created spaces in which these existing rules could be ignored. That's why I want to speak of deregulated spaces. Yeah? Regulations could be ignored here, and physicians could go to these spaces, for instance, into concentration camps, like Auschwitz or Dachau or others. There was no formal law or decree or anything which said you can do your research there. They just knew it and they did it. In practice, this happened like a physician who was interested in doing specific research, which was because he thought the question is important, urgent, and so on. And it's he had an idea how to do it in program, kind of application. So this application was directed to the SS, you know the SS, because the SS was responsible for the administration of all the concentration camps. So the SS had to agree, but the initiative came from the physicians. An interesting process. And there are even some cases where the physicians applied to do research in a camp, and the SS refused to have that, which is highly irritating, I think. Yeah. So we have usually the idea that Himmler or Hitler or some guys, politicians, imposed wishes of some kind of very strange sadistic research on physicians, and they were carried through. But this is not the case, not at all. Yeah, the initiative for practically all of the atrocious research in the Nazi context originated from physicians. So, but psychiatric asylums were another example for its deregulated space. And also, in the context of the war, there were especially Jewish hospitals in the occupied territories in Eastern Europe, which were used as such spaces where you could do more or less everything you wanted as a researcher. So research subjects were available. They move freely, so you had control over them. It was a very nice situation, if you want, ironically said, of course. A colleague of us in Oxford has put up a database and tries to reconstruct the identities of all the victims of this kind of forced medical research in deregulated spaces. And he has indeed arrived at a number now of 29,000 victims, which is horrendous, I think. Not all of them have been killed, but many of them have been killed in the course of the research. But those who survived, they were heavily traumatized, both mentally and physically, of course. What were the justifications of the physicians who did this kind of research? It was, they said, well, we did this. They said it already amongst themselves during the war when they did it. We should do that because this is an urgent question. Due to the war condition, for instance, protection against epidemics, developing vaccines or drugs against infectious diseases, for instance, which was, of course, it's always a problem related to wars, epidemics, but also methods to help to improve the survival of wounded soldiers and so on. This was the one, so they saw urgent questions and they were there. I mean, if you look at the individual cases of research, you can see that the research questions were not absurd, but in almost all cases, they were relevant in this specific context. And some of the questions were even debated internationally, which you can see if you look at the programs of international conferences, medical conferences. You can see that these were debated questions. So they were not absurd, yeah, as it's sometimes assumed today that those questions were obsolete or whatever. That's not the case. And they could do it on these individuals in these deregulated spaces because they said to themselves, because some of them had doubts if that should be done, but yes, we can do it because the human beings there in this kind of spaces, they are of biologically or legally of minor value. So it might be justified with a pressing question, and we have potential subjects in the camps who are not really of the same value as proper Germans, like Jewish people, for instance, or other minority groups, like so-called gypsies and so on, or mentally handicapped people. So these were the justifications, and these were justifications which were even used in the post-war trials against these physicians. So they were really serious about this kind of justifications. One special aspect of research was the research on cadavers and body specimens from victims of Nazi injustice, political prisoners who had been executed, or victims of this euthanasia program. They were used for research purposes, in particular their brains for neuropathological research, but also the bodies and these specimens were used for teaching purposes. And indeed, even in the post-war period, I'll come to that later. And so we have here sort of a problem which concerns 29,000 victims, or potentially some more. And it really concerns hundreds, if not thousands, of physicians. Okay. Oops. It's going backwards now. Okay. So I've given you a very dense sort of an overview of the main events in this period of Nazism. Our assumptions, our ideas about what happened there are very much shaped, even today, by some problematic assumptions, which I want to call myths. And these myths have the function of exoneration. They came up immediately after the war, usually formulated by physicians' organizations or representatives of physicians, but they prevail until today, and sort of they, in a way, they give a format and create narratives about what has happened, but narratives which are very apologetic, not only for individual physicians involved, but also for the medical community in Germany and internationally, actually. So the first myth is that medical atrocities were committed by a few fanatic Nazi doctors. They were the result of irrational ideologies imposed from outside Nazi politicians on apolitical physicians. It's completely wrong, actually. As I have already shown in some sort of minor examples, the initiative of practically all of these atrocities came from physicians themselves or from medical organizations, yeah, for the sterilization program, for the systematic patient killings, and also for forced human subject research. The second myth would be that the programs of mass sterilization and patient killings were the expression of an ideology that had nothing to do with contemporary state-of-the-art medical reasoning and practice. Yes, that's what we frequently assume, but it's not true. The program of mass sterilization was inspired by eugenics. Eugenics was a concept and an idea formulated in the late 19th century by a British statistician, Francis Galton, and the more or less synonymously created concept of racial hygiene, which was very prominently used in Nazi Germany, but it also originated in the late 19th century. It was coined, the phrase racial hygiene, by a German physician called Alfred Plötz. And from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, there was a broad eugenic movement internationally, which led to the establishment of eugenic organizations, the first one actually in the United States and in Scandinavia, but also in Germany, but also in South America, for instance, in Asia. You had eugenic organizations. There were eugenic research institutions, which were sort of the predecessors of modern medical genetic research institutions, like Cold Spring Harbor, which you probably know in New York, was an institution set up with a eugenic intention. It did research in medical genetics, but it was called a eugenic research program. So we have this kind of research institutions all over the place, in Scandinavia, in Germany, in Scandinavia, and in Britain, and in the United States. And we have eugenically motivated sterilization laws. As I mentioned, in the United States, from 1907 onwards, there was the first eugenic sterilization law was passed. And around 1930, so that's even before the Nazis came to power, there were roughly 25 sterilization laws in various US states. In three Canadian provinces, there were eugenically motivated sterilization laws, and also in Denmark, in Europe. And the German physicians who made an argument and who pressed the German government already in the Weimar Republic and then in the Nazi period to pass a sterilization law, they pointed to the US situation and they said, well, they have these laws, we need it. Look at the states. They are our model. Indeed, the situation in the States was a model for the German law. And once the German law existed, the American eugenicists pointed to Germany and said they make it much more coherently and much more put it in practice much more consequently than we do it here. Yeah, so we should improve our laws according to the German model. Interesting collusion, cooperation, whatever, between the eugenicists on an international level. And the patient killings as well, the so-called euthanasia program in the Nazi period, didn't start immediately in 1933. It started only in 1939 for various pragmatical reasons, you might say, but it had a long prehistory. The idea that there exists life unworthy of living, which can be diagnosed in a way by physicians, by experts, is an idea which originated in the late 19th century as well. It was not directly connected to eugenics in the beginning, but there were convergences later. And there were even euthanasia associations in the United States, in the UK, and in Germany long before the Nazi takeover. So this program of mass killing, in the way it was implemented in Germany, this is specific and it needed the political context, but the idea to do something like this existed much, much earlier. So it's again, these ideas, the concepts, and also the underlying value hierarchies, they are not specific for the Nazi period. And the third myth is that the activities of medical scientists experimenting on humans in what I call deregulated spaces, where the expression of racial ideology or individual perversion disguised as science, and that these kind of activities should better be called pseudoscience. It's really a myth. As I already mentioned, most of the specific or concrete research projects which were pursued in these deregulated spaces, if you look closely at them, if you look at the questions asked, the medical questions, the research question, you can see that it's up to date and it's urgent, it makes sense in this specific context of war, for instance. So the questions were not outdated. And also the methods applied to answer to these questions, they were state of the art, if you look at them closely. And it is a little bit difficult to reconstruct that, but you have to get to papers, personal communication, and so, and sometimes also the publications out of this research. And you can see this is the kind of methodology which was used internationally to answer this kind of questions. Sometimes these methodologies were indeed innovative, or they existed in theory, but they couldn't put into practice because of ethical reasons in sort of normal situations. But in Germany, in these deregulated spaces, you could do what others couldn't do in the United States or in Britain. So the problem with this kind of research is not that it was outdated, that it was absurd or something like that, or only the result of sadistic psychopaths. But the problem is that there was a scientific rationality to this, but this was not sort of aligned with humanitarian thoughts, but it was combined with the complete disregard of the humanity of the research subjects. So there was a disconnection between scientific rationality and humanity, if you want, ethics in our sense. Okay, oops. Well, these are some myths, and this is about Nazi medicine. So it gives you some information not only about what we think happened there, but also the misunderstandings and misconceptions. Yeah, and I think this is important to correct that. Another misconception about what happened in this context is that everything was a result of outside pressure. I've already mentioned that in the context of the first myth, but was there also a choice for physicians? Yeah, could they take choices? And they could. And I think, again, this is a very important message in a way for us today. Yeah? Even if we have a tough government expecting us to do certain things or pressing us to do certain things in medicine, but also in general, we have a space with a scope of action. Even in this totalitarian context, you can see it. And you can illustrate this scope of action by looking at a very, very simple number, namely the percentage of physicians, of German physicians, which were members of the Nazi Party. The percentage is, with regional differences, it's between 55 and 65%. So let's say 60% of the German physicians were members in the Nazi Party. This number has two implications. It tells us that 40% of these physicians were not members in the party. So they could take a decision. They were not forced to enter the party. Yeah? And this is really in stark contrast to what was told us in Germany, but also internationally, if physicians, German physicians were asked by their international colleagues in the 1950s or 60s, were you a member of the Nazi party? Yes, I was a member, but I had to join it. Yeah, otherwise something terrible would have happened to me or my family and so on. It's not true. Yeah, 40% of the German physicians could not be detained in prisons and so on. This is completely impossible for this, even for this regime. Yeah, so you had a choice. There was a scope of action, and this means there was responsibility. Yeah, it's up to the individual physician to take a choice. He or she is responsible. The number is interesting for another second reason. Namely, this percentage is true for physicians. 60% roughly of German physicians were members of the Nazi party. But the percentage of membership in Nazi organizations, in particular in the NSDAP, was amongst physicians much higher than in other academic professions. For instance, amongst lawyers and teachers, in a very similar position. They were also mostly employed in public institutions, schools and courts and so on. The number was 25 to 30%. Yeah, although even for them there was pressure to join, but only 25-30% of them did join. So, and there is a significant difference between physicians and lawyers, for instance. Yeah, so that is a difference which is in need of explanation. And what is the explanation? There are quite a number of factors going into the preparedness of physicians to join the Nazi party, and that means more generally to go along with what was expected and asked from them. And one reason is certainly that the situation of physicians in Germany before the Nazi takeover was not that good. There was not one overarching organization of physicians, but there were 3 or 4 big factions which fought each other. So physicians could not speak with one voice towards the government. But they wanted to have one overarching organization, but they didn't manage to create that. And they had also the problem, not only infight between these groups, but there were also healers on the healing market, if you want, on the health market, who had not gone through a medical curriculum and had not taken any medical exam, but the term Arzt or physician was a free term. Everybody could use it, even if you had no medical exam. And they were a strong competition for physicians on the market, on the health market, if you want. And physicians always wanted to have a kind of hierarchy between themselves and these non-medical healers. But it didn't exist legally. It was a completely deregulated healing market, if you want. Yeah. So physicians wanted regulation, interestingly, by the state to help them, in contrast to these healers. And the Nazi party promised, if you elect us, they promised it already in the end of the 20s, if you elect us, we will create an overarching medical professional organization, and we will pass a law which creates privileges for physicians and creates a hierarchy between those who have studied medicine, who have a medical exam, and those healers who haven't. And they did it. Yeah, they created what is today the German Medical Association. It was created in the Nazi period. And they passed a law which still exists with lots of modifications in detail, but it still exists as Heilpraktikergesetz, or a law for non-medical practitioners. It's interesting. And physicians, the physicians community, they were very grateful to the new government for these two, fulfilling these two strong wishes. Another point is that there was a very high unemployment at the end of the Weimar Republic in general, because the state, due to reparations, but also due to the international crash, withdraw money from public services and also from medical services. So there was a very high unemployment, 15 to 20% in various parts of healthcare. And physicians, in particular young physicians, were very unsatisfied with the situation. So again, the Nazi Party at the end of the 20s and early 30s, before they came to power, they promised, we need you that much. We will help you to get all proper physicians. If they are German, proper Germans, they will have full employment for everyone. And they would do that by kicking out Jewish physicians out of their positions or politically unreliable physicians, and they even created more jobs in general, in particular for these hereditary health policies. And it worked. Yeah, so the unemployment disappeared. So physicians were very grateful to the new city, and they had a very high affinity, more so than lawyers and others. Oops. Were the attitudes, behavior patterns, and value hierarchies underlying the atrocities questioned by physicians in the post-war period? Well, I would say not really. Many of the doctors involved also held prominent positions in the post-war period and were actually well integrated in the international medical community. They were invited to conferences, they were co-authors in publications, and so on and so on. And nobody asked them, even international colleagues, nobody asked them, and also amongst German physicians, they didn't talk about the past, they looked forward. Also, if on another level you find stigmatizing and debasing terms and conduct towards sick and disabled people, terms and conduct which legitimized the atrocious activities because they are lower values and so on and so on, you find that in the post-war period in Germany, but also internationally. In the post-war period, you find also that body and brain specimens originating from atrocities in the Nazi context were used, continue to be used for teaching and research purposes at university medical schools, at the elite Max Planck institutes, and some of the neuropathological specimens which were harvested for the Max Planck institutes, formerly Kaiser Wilhelm institutes, they even were exchanged for other specimens to American colleagues, and we only recently found out that there must still be brain specimens here in American medical collections from these atrocious contexts. And on another level, you find that medical eponyms honoring physicians responsible for massive atrocities in the Nazi context are still in use today. You know probably that there is a discussion about this, and in some cases these eponyms have been abolished, but there are still many cases in which these eponyms still exist. And again, this is the result of not exactly looking at these names and the persons behind the names. Well, what was the post-war response of professional medical bodies and individual physicians to the medical atrocities in the Nazi period? We can distinguish three kinds of behavior patterns. After very few years immediately after the end of the war, where there were quite a lot of public debates and also trials, but then there was silence. There was silence in most of the German medical community and also in the international medical community. International colleagues didn't ask the Germans about this past. They didn't want to touch on that. There was a small group of physicians, mainly of Jewish origin, or Polish physicians, who tried to hold that on the agenda, but not very successful actually. So in their in-groups, it was a topic, but outside, it was not really a topic. But sometimes these physicians with a Jewish background or Polish or some others, some leftist physicians, they asked the representatives of medical institutions, what did you do as an institution or as an individual physician in that period, really? And sometimes very specific. And then you find the second kind of behavior, scapegoating. that the responsibilities for atrocious behavior is attributed to individual fanatic Nazi doctors or SS doctors or the Nazi state. I mean, that's the first myth. The pressure is from outside, or there are few individuals within the medical community, but they are cranks, psychopaths, and so on, which is not true, as I said. And only from the in the 1980s onwards, there started a slow process of systematic self-reflection amongst physicians and the medical community. And it started actually from the margins of the medical community. Medical students asked questions again and again, and also psychiatrists, for instance, in mental institutions, looked in the histories of their own institutions and then started asking broader questions. But this kind of initiative and this movement did not start at the top of the medical community in medical associations or medical schools from the deans, but from the margin. And only from the early 2000s onwards, professional medical bodies started systematic investigations. Well, whoops. So there are also three basic ethical regimes or declarations which were indeed formulated in response to the medical atrocities during the Nazi period. The first one is actually, it was not formulated by physicians, but by the court. There was the big publicized Nuremberg medical trial from 1946 to 47, and in the final verdict of this trial, the lawyers, the judges, formulated a code, this later called Nuremberg Code, which was the first international formulation of principles for ethical research on human beings. I told you that there were German regulations already existing from the early 1930s, but on an international level, there didn't exist anything like that. The second document is the Declaration of Geneva, formulated in 1948 by the World Medical Association, an organization which was itself founded as a response to Nazi medical atrocities and the Nuremberg medical trial, because the international community of physicians was worried that the atrocities and the severe misconduct of so many physicians would result in distrust of the public towards the medical profession. So they set up this WMA, and the WMA proclaimed as one of its first activities the Declaration of Geneva. And 17 years later, in 1964, after very extensive and heated and sort of negotiations, they also managed to formulate a document, the Declaration of Helsinki, addressing issues of human subject research, which had already been addressed by the Nuremberg Code. But I have to say, and I can't go into much detail of that now, this Declaration of Helsinki, which was formulated by physicians in contrast to the Nuremberg Code, it weakened the protection of research subjects, an interesting process. So my last slide, I want to summarize the massive atrocities in medicine during the Nazi period were not the activities of a few marginal and fanaticized doctors. Rather, these atrocities took place with the substantial participation of leading representatives of the medical community and medical institutions. And this, I think, poses some questions. Almost all of the atrocities were initiated by physicians, not by political authorities. Again, this is sort of cause for thought, I think. However, it has to be stressed that the Nazi state created the infrastructure to put the underlying ideas and resulting medical initiatives into a very radical practice. And this is an interesting constellation, which may be described as collusion between medicine and the state. So what happened is not the result of outside pressure, but it's the result of a collusion between the medical community and the state, a collusion which we have also beyond the Nazi period, but not in this extreme way. Or you might also frame this, so what has happened, this kind of collusion as a constellation in which both spheres, politics and medicine and science, represented resources for each other. Both needed each other to get to some common ends, like strengthening the folk body. This was an end, an ideal, which was pursued both by the state and by many physicians. The underlying ideas, attitudes, and value hierarchies creating the conditions for these atrocities were not specific for the Nazi period, but this period rather showed an extreme manifestation of problematic potentials which exist in medicine in general. And I also hope to have shown that the historical knowledge was a starting point and reference for ethical declarations and a late starting systematic self-reflection in the medical profession. Thank you very much.
So I'm afraid we're out of time, but we do have an hour with Dr. Roelcke in the Fulginity Pavilion. Anyone who would like to come and has time to come, obviously welcome to come over. I'll thank you once again, Volker, for a very stimulating and provocative talk. Appreciate you.
Okay.
Thank you.